So thank you all for joining me for my final presentation wrap-up kind of seminar that will hopefully tell you a little story about what I've been up to for the last 3 years at my Knowledge Exchange Fellowship. Before I begin, I just want to let you know that we are actually recording this. So before you think about asking me questions about juicy gossip about working with big business, don't do it. I will be presenting, the work that I've been doing, and happy to be, discussing some things offline maybe later. So yeah, I've been here for 3 years, but before I started this work, let me turn this on. I thought I might just introduce where I came from. I came from Australia. I started off my career as a marine scientist. I was really passionate about the marine environment. I studied intertidal reefs, the animals and plants and the interactions between them to really understand how our ecosystems work and how humans affect those ecosystems. But when I was doing that work, I got really much more interested in, God, we do a lot of research. And where does it go? What happens to this research? Is it really influencing the big wide world? And so through my career up until now, which is just last year, I was presenting at a sustainable fashion event about conservation science, business and biodiversity. I've become much more interested in trying to bridge that gap between science and practice. How do we really get our research into practice? And why I came here to do this Knowledge Exchange Fellowship was really so I could not be one of those scientists, not talking down from my ivory tower to people in the outside world. I really wanted to start to bridge that gap. And so knowledge exchange is an emerging discipline, and it really represents this sort of a body of work, experience and practice around how scientists are starting to bridge that gap between science and practice. And there's some great work that's been done by Professor Mark Reed, who is at the University of Newcastle, who talks a lot about how we can do knowledge exchange to achieve research impact. And this is all around how do you actually start to design research that actually engages with the outside world, that actually starts to address real world environmental and sustainability challenges. And so to me, knowledge exchange is all about, a range of activities that you need to undertake to start to bridge that gap. But the ultimate aim of knowledge exchange is to help people in the outside world understand a body of research or knowledge that might be able to help address some of their challenges. This is not about pushing research onto people in the outside world. So the idea is that we could help start to, with our science, help to start to address challenges in the outside world, help to change understandings of issues of environmental sustainability issues in the outside world. Those could help lead to policy and practice changes, like real tangible changes in the way that we manage our environment, for example, and policies that are set up to actually protect our environment. And ultimately, it's all about research impact. And the impact in environmental science is all about, well, what can we do to actually help change and enhance the environment, actually produce positive outcomes for the environment from our research. Now, these two sort of triangles down the bottom kind of indicate, look, the extent of real-world impact, increases as you get towards those actual real-world impacts. But the extent of control of scientists and knowledge exchange fellows like myself really is in the other end of the spectrum. So we do a whole range of activities, but hopefully with a theory of change that can lead to these impacts. But a 3-year fellowship, I get to changes in understanding and maybe a few policy and practice changes if I'm lucky. But that's kind of just being realistic about how long knowledge exchange processes can take to actually achieve real world impact. And so there's this great diagram, the kind of knowledge exchange or public engagement onion rings, I call them. This is from MPLS, showed this diagram recently. Basically, it's the same for public engagement and knowledge exchange. There's a whole range of activities and theories around how you can start to actually get research into practice. And the outer rings really represent a whole lot of activities that you can undertake to start to inform and inspire the outside world. you then work towards, trying to get, it's really about getting to the center of that onion, those onion rings. You can consult, you can, start to ask people, what are your challenges? What science do I have to actually help address your challenges? And it goes through to co-production. How can I work with you, government agencies, businesses, NGOs, to help connect the science that I have to address your challenges, but let's co-produce that research. Let's do it together. Let's, create new research that actually specifically addresses your challenges. And so that's just a little bit of introduction to knowledge exchange, what it means to me. And now I'll delve into, why I started working with businesses on biodiversity. And so some people, quite rightly ask me, why would you work with businesses? Why are they even talking about biodiversity? And there are a range of motivations that are kind of pushing businesses towards considering biodiversity loss as both a risk and an opportunity to their business. And these motivations relate to, they just have to. There are regulatory and legal reasons. There are financial lending requirements now for many businesses to actually, that make them consider biodiversity. There are reasons operationally why they would consider biodiversity. For example, companies that rely on natural resource extraction to actually be more efficient operationally. So, and it comes down to managing risk and money ultimately. These are the reasons why they're considering biodiversity. Yes, as environmental scientists, we would love to think that all businesses just want to do something, work for the greater good, but they don't all. And there are a range of motivations for why they are even jumping into this space. And so it's important to recognise that, I think. And so the World Economic Forum releases this global risks report every year for 14 years. Biodiversity, which is kind of in the centre, for all the environmental, the green diamonds, are up now in the right-hand top quadrant of this global risks landscape. And that basically represents what business leaders around the world consider as the most, really material risks that are posed to both society and business. And so biodiversity over the last 14 years has kind of been skipping up, towards that right-hand quadrant. It's becoming more and more of a material risk to businesses. So this is why it's becoming an issue that businesses can't ignore. On the flip side of those risks, there's also the Sustainable Development Goals that represent this great positive sort of, the societal, goals that we would love to achieve that help address the societal issues, environmental issues, and governance issues. Now, this report here is from the United Nations. It's about, what businesses think of the SDGs. If you open up a business annual report now, a sustainability report, SDG logos are all over them. So they're paying attention to the SDGs. Now, the size of these squares represent the magnitude of importance to different businesses and the activities that they believe that they are undertaking that contribute to these SDGs. The little biodiversity ones, life on land and life below water, come right at the bottom of the list. But the whole, the great thing about the SDGs is they come as a package. And, this really is an opportunity for more and more businesses to think about biodiversity. Oh, is it an issue? Should we be aware of it? What should we be doing to minimise our impacts and think about our dependencies on biodiversity? And so, what are businesses doing so far with biodiversity? So at the start of my Knowledge Exchange Fellowship, I worked with my collaborators, EJ Milner-Gulland and Joe Bull, and we conducted a piece of research really so I could just get my head around. I had not worked with businesses before, so I needed to understand what the current state of play was, where businesses were up to in considering biodiversity. And so what we did was we looked at the Fortune 100, the top 100 of the Fortune 500 global companies. And we looked at their sustainability reports. I went through 100 sustainability reports, looking at how they mention biodiversity and what they do, what they say they're doing in terms of addressing both impacts and dependencies on biodiversity. And so these companies are quite representative of a broad range of sectors, 15 sectors. Headquarters occur in around 15 countries. They're big, lots of revenue, lots of employees. And quite nicely in the bottom left-hand corner here, you can see that these they represent high, medium and low biodiversity risk sectors. And by high, that means companies that have big impacts or big dependencies on biodiversity. Medium, it's a little bit, a little bit more indirect. And low, there are companies like healthcare. So quite conveniently, there's a nice cross-section of companies that sit across those different risk sectors. And what we found was of those 100, 49 actually mentioned biodiversity in their sustainability reports, which I was like, oh, that's pretty good. Interesting. But really when you delve into it, only 5 companies actually make quite clear commitments as to what they're really going to do to manage their biodiversity impacts. What do they want to achieve? What sort of specific, measurable and time-bound commitments are they making for biodiversity? That was only 5. Now, back to the 49. 49, mentioned a range of activities that they're undertaking. Things like, we develop partnerships with NGOs to tackle biodiversity loss. We're restoring some habitats. We're planting wildflower meadows around our factories. Things like that. Only 9 companies specifically measure the quantitative, this is how much we're doing for biodiversity in relation to those activities. And that often related to things like sustainable sourcing of products like paper and pulp or seafood. So it's the kind of the supermarkets aiming to have 100% sustainably certified products by 2020. What we found though was, we were really looking as conservation scientists, are these businesses measuring like what happens to biodiversity after they've done these activities? What are the outcomes for biodiversity? No, none of them really measure that. So there's a way to go for businesses to actually improve, their corporate biodiversity accountability. And so in comes this Knowledge Exchange Fellowship. So how can we help businesses tackle biodiversity loss? So in 2016, I joined EJ and Joe to undertake this Knowledge Exchange Fellowship. And our broad aim was for me to be available to work with multinational businesses to help provide conservation science or, biodiversity solutions to businesses to help drive improvements in corporate biodiversity practice. Now, this aim evolved, of course, as most things do, over the period of the Knowledge Exchange Fellowship. So originally it was just to help businesses, and then and the practitioners who they work with became really important, and that will become apparent very soon. So basically, our conservation science that we could offer the business world is a range of tools and approaches that are used to help, often work with governments. These have been used for decades to help both protect, conserve and mitigate against biodiversity loss. And so these are broad decision-making processes, and with these come a whole lot of modelling tools and techniques, quantitative and qualitative techniques that can really help businesses start to understand and manage their impacts. And so there are 3 big areas where we started to work with businesses and the practitioners that they work with to help address and improve corporate biodiversity accountability. And these 3 things were around developing, how can we help businesses actually make more science-based commitments to biodiversity? How can we help businesses really understand, once you've set those commitments, what do you do? What actions can you undertake to really genuinely contribute to not only managing your impacts, but improving the status of biodiversity? And finally, how do you develop indicators that help you measure whether your commitments have been achieved and whether your actions have been effective? And so what businesses would even work with academics in this setting? So we had 3 partners lined up at the start of my fellowship to work with: BP, Kering and Sainsbury's Supermarkets. In the end, I worked with only one of those companies directly. As you will see, these things take a long time. These companies, one of the companies is now ready to work with us now after 3 years of talking. But this is one thing you can never underestimate with knowledge exchange is, to actually have real world impact and work with partners in the outside world, you've got to work at their timelines. So in the end, the partners that I worked with was this kind of ecosystem of both some businesses but government agencies and NGOs, consultancies that work with them. So it's kind of this ecosystem of organisations that I ended up working with. The central circle represents the organisations that I actually formed partnerships with to do specific pieces of work. And the outer sphere represents a whole lot of companies, organisations that I consulted with along the 3 years of my fellowship. I'll focus on some of the inside circle examples now with some key collaborations. So again, on these 3 topics, I'm going to talk to you about 3 specific projects that I have, one with BP, the one with a business, one with the JNCC, the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, who are a UK government body, and one with the OCN, an NGO. So first of all, with BP, it was quite a specific piece of work that I did with them. They were interested in our science behind commitments like no net loss and how businesses can really mitigate their biodiversity impacts. So what I did was I worked with my colleague at BP and I wrote a report. I spoke to him, we had a range of meetings and little workshops, lots of back and forth, and I developed a short report that was specifically in a format that he really required because he needed to take that up to his, to higher levels within the organisation to convince them that this should and could be used within the new group-wide guidelines on managing biodiversity. And so that report and, my advice did feed into this updated biodiversity management policy that was for the corporate level to guide all new operations as to how they could achieve no net loss. And so a quote from my collaborator in the BP, why did they do this and why was it beneficial? Well, he really found that it was quite invaluable to make sure that their practices were underpinned by good science. That was one of their key motivations. And like I said, to help really justify improvements within BP. So that kind of scientific credibility really helped in this case. Next up is work that I conducted with the JNCC, and this is focusing on business action. So this work came about, I used to actually work for the JNCC about 10 or more years ago, but on marine monitoring stuff. So it was quite different, but I encountered someone at the JNCC that I thought, who said, oh, we're working with businesses on biodiversity. I was like, oh, okay, you're a government agency. I thought you were just, focusing on government stuff. No. And what we started talking for quite some time before we set up this partnership, but basically, I always remember in the first year of my fellowship, I was attending a workshop in Cambridge with lots of business people, and I had this business guy corner me and say, look, the problem with you conservation scientists is you just need to tell us what to do. You need to tell us, what action should we be taking? What commitments should we be making? And I was like, well, it's not really up to you. You need to own it. So I'm not going to tell you what to do. I can certainly work with you, but there are international biodiversity goals that are set by the Convention for Biological Diversity. They would be a pretty good place to start as to commitments to make and actions to undertake. And it became quite apparent that businesses just don't look at those international conventions other than the SDGs. So what happened is I joined, this is Matt Smith, and we decided, look, let's put out a little research proposal for a Valuing Nature partnership. And we got our intern, Tom Smith, who did a great piece of work with us for 4 months to tackle this very issue. How can we help make international biodiversity goals more relevant to businesses so they can actually see the relevance to their everyday activities, and that could inspire even more action from business? And so the SDGs are the hook. We were like, what can we do to get businesses really, doing stuff for biodiversity? And we realized that the SDGs are the hook. So what Tom did first, and what others have also done before, is looked at the crossover between SDGs here and all of the multilateral environmental agreements that we have, which are, just confusing to businesses, quite frankly. There's so many of them, and there's so many targets and things, and they're all for different sorts of aspects of biodiversity. It's quite confusing. But they all do actually fit within these 5 strategic goals, which are specified by the Convention on Biological Diversity. And so what Tom did was he showed, look, there are lots of interlinkages. And, you know, businesses can delve into this. This is a resource for businesses. But this was not really an end in itself. This was a means to an end for us to then start to go, okay, we've demonstrated that the SDGs link to these 5 strategic goals. These 5 strategic goals are written for governments, by governments, for governments. So the first thing that we did, which we just, you know, tweaked the wording so they would look more relevant to businesses, to really illustrate what businesses could do. And then we started to, by actually doing, you know, Tom did this great piece of research, doing lots of coding of the individual targets within all the multilateral environmental agreements to show, you know, just by flipping the text of some of these targets, you could start to find specific activities and actions that businesses could undertake to contribute to those goals. So he did that big piece of work, and then we put a call out for business case studies to actually start to really illustrate the specifics of these are lots of businesses are already doing stuff around these. So we were just making the connections between SDGs, International Biodiversity Goals, what we now call Corporate Biodiversity Goals, and a range of business actions across different sectors, locations around the world. And so the output, this was just a 4-month piece of work, which is still continuing with little bits and pieces, like a paper now. You know, but the first thing that we did was we wrote a government report and a practice note for businesses. And so what did the JNCC get out of this? Well, the JNCC found that infographic, that table, just this table, they found that incredibly useful just to start to be able to use that as a resource to communicate to businesses. See, these international biodiversity goals are relevant to businesses, and this is how. And then they also found that this process of working together actually has led to new approaches that they're considering, both the JNCC and DEFRA, in terms of how they engage businesses in the discussions around the post-2020 biodiversity strategy, which is being redeveloped by the Convention on Biological Diversity. So that's pretty good. That was a good collaboration, we thought. And then the final one that I'll talk to you about, and this is really the longest running piece of work that I undertook, was with a partnership with the IUCN. It was all about biodiversity indicators for business. And so our project really addressed this question: how can businesses just be better supported in developing biodiversity indicators? And this came about, again, I met my collaborators at the IUCN really early on in my first year, and we started talking for quite some time. And I was like, you know, there's a range of initiatives out there for developing biodiversity indicators for business. And to me, as a conservation scientist who has done a lot of this, developing biodiversity indicators for governments, I think they're missing a few kind of crucial steps. And that is because what was happening is a lot of these initiatives were jumping into, okay, what data is available, or what can we grab off the shelf that we can just like retrofit and businesses can use, or, you know, let's just focus on the data or the model that the indicator is about. And I was like, hang on, don't you need to ask a business why they would use this biodiversity indicator? What sort of application it would be relevant to, how they will use it? Is it for internal decision making, external communications? There's a range of, kind of initial questions that you need to ask to be able to develop an indicator that will be really fit for purpose. So what we did is not what I intended to be doing as a part of my KE fellowship, but it became apparent that it was quite critical, was we consulted a range of businesses and practitioners that work with businesses to try and understand all the indicators, initiatives that are out there, and all the things that businesses are saying they need indicators for. What are they really for? What sort of spatial and temporal scales are they addressing in science terms? But in business terms, it was about how can we define the business scopes for use of biodiversity indicators. And we managed to show that, it's common sense, but no one had done this, that basically there's a range of indicators, of course, for biodiversity management at the site level and landscape scale. But then you start to float up to along supply chains, at the corporate level, and it gets a little bit more disconnected from specifically what's happening on the ground. And a lot of businesses are now asking for, we want to, you know, assess our biodiversity performance, say at a unit or corporate level. We want to report this in our external sustainability reports against things like the Global Reporting Initiative. And then, of course, there are third parties that are assessing the biodiversity performance of companies from the outside. So this kind of helped just go, okay, let's just be clear when we're talking about biodiversity indicators, where exactly in the spectrum do you sit? Because we need to get that straight before we can develop indicators that really work. And so this is where I got to then start to bring some of the science in really quite simple ways that kind of would resonate with a business audience. And that was, we said, look, you know, the reason that this is important to work out this spectrum is to really start to break down what the critical elements are of why you would need indicators. And this, you know, relates to, I need a business, if I'm going to develop an indicator for a business or a set of indicators, I need you to specify what your goal or what your objective is. I need you to articulate biodiversity is genes, species, ecosystems, everything in between, and the living environment. It can be everything you want it to be or just one or two things that you want it to be. Businesses need to start to articulate what it is, what aspect of biodiversity are they actually wanting to measure. And we can help, you know, that's not just leading them up to it, but it's a, you know, collaborative process. When do you want to assess your biodiversity performance? Is it about assessing current impacts, or is it about predicting future changes or future dependencies? Those are two very different things, which will call upon very different indicators potentially. Who is this for? Is it for internal decision making at the site level, you know, environmental impact assessment kind of stuff? Or is it at the corporate level to have a picture of all of your operations? How is your biodiversity performance? Or is it for external disclosure? That will dictate what type of indicator you end up with and how it's evaluated and communicated. Really, these are two fundamental things. It's about spatial and temporal scale. At what, you know, how often do you want to undertake your assessments and how detailed do you want this to be? These are critical because biodiversity data, you know, will be operates at very different scales depending on what indicator you end up with. And what I was seeing was, this is a classic example, and hopefully the IUCN won't kill me for this, but the IUCN Red List, it's, you know, it's a record of threatened species at different sort of threat categories that is updated maybe every decade if you're lucky. And it's not comprehensive for all species, all groups of species. And often it's really good at a global picture, national picture maybe. But what I was seeing is businesses saying, can we just use the IUCN Red List? And I'm like, well, what, do you want to use it for like annual reporting or something? And they're like, yeah, and we want to, you know, every year we want to do this. So I'm like, well, it's not updated every year, so it's not going to be changing. It's not going to be sensitive to your needs. So this is why, and it was this piece of work that allowed me to bring in our science even more and really introduce this concept of you need a process to guide indicator development to really ensure that businesses will end up with fit for purpose indicators. And this is where the what, why, how, who all goes into clarifying the decision context. By the way, this represents things like structured decision making, the Common Measures Partnership that's used in conservation. There are a bunch of frameworks that are already used in conservation that this broadly represents. So I'm just repackaging it and illustrating how it's relevant to business. And importantly, it puts indicators right in the middle of this process. So it's framed, the indicator development is framed within a full management cycle. It's not just, let's just grab a random indicator based on some data that's available and away you go. And so this piece of work culminated in both a workshop report, a science workshop report. We got a bunch of scientists together to talk about all this, the science behind this. And then a report for businesses, which was developed by the IUCN, so that was all communicated. Webinars we ran, gave presentations, have talked about this quite a lot at a number of events. And basically this work is ongoing. And to date, it's been presented to about 300 or so and business and NGO representatives through all of our promotion last year. It's already been integrated into 2 other international initiatives that are focused on biodiversity indicator development for both the extractive sector and finance sector. It's informed the establishment of an international working group called Aligning Measures for Business, where basically everyone's like, yeah, this is a bit of a mess. We kind of need to like get together and work out what we're recommending to businesses internationally. And it is forming the kind of foundation for the IUCN draft guidelines on planning and monitoring for corporate biodiversity performance, because we saw that there's a real gap there. The site level stuff, the landscape stuff is kind of sorted with businesses through a range of, biodiversity offsetting, mitigation hierarchy, environmental impact assessment. It's when you start to float up at the corporate level and you're not really attached to the ground to where biodiversity changes are truly happening. That's where we think far more guidance is required and help for businesses is required. And so there you go. There are some examples of the work that I did to help develop commitments, align, business actions and promote more business actions to achieve, proper gains for biodiversity, and how to develop biodiversity indicators. And it wasn't developing specific indicators, it was all about that process. And so how did this go? I was preparing this presentation yesterday, and I thought the best thing I could do was put a NERC report an annual report that I prepared into a word cloud. And basically, what did it all mean? I ran a whole lot of workshops, I joined a whole lot of panels, I advised on things, there were lots of projects, there was lots and lots of, it was a lot of talking. I was going out, a lot of my colleagues here in the ICCS were like, Prue, what are you doing? Where do you go all the time? There's lots of external engagement, lots of panel discussions. So yeah, I just got in there. There's a little optimism at the top there. So yeah, there was a lot of activity, and really, if I had my way, I would want to keep this work going for another, multiple years. 3 years, we've just scratched the surface. But from those 3 years, I thought I'd share with you what I think are some kind of critical factors to achieving, successful knowledge exchange. And a little spoiler alert, none of this has anything to do with science. So the first thing to me is really networks are so important. My network is the reason that I've been able to do the work that I've done, my connections with other people. I started from scratch 3 years ago, so I did spend a lot of time going out, getting to know people, understanding who the kind of key people in that network were, that business and biodiversity network. As you saw from the start, I thought I was just going to be working with 3 businesses. It became very apparent very quickly that I needed to engage in the broader network, which was NGOs, consultants, government agencies and businesses and other academics, to actually work out where I could contribute as an individual most productively over 3 years. And so by networking lots, building my network, I was able to identify who the kind of key people were that make stuff happen, also the key people that kind of block stuff that I could either try and work with or just avoid. But those are all, this is not what scientists are trained in. So this was, going out and working, talking to other people about how to do this, going to a business school to think about this. So networks are critical. And the most important thing to understand about a network is your own. Once you can't just pass on a network to someone else. It's all about the trust and the personal relationships that you build. So it's a really, that's been incredibly valuable for me as an individual to develop that over the last few years. So what I found and what I see, I've done, so I've done this type of work with government agencies before as well. And I've seen many, many scientists develop shiny tools, shiny models and go, here you go, I didn't consult business or government very much, but here, isn't this cool? Like I've got an app and it's cool, it's really like shiny. Here, have it, use it. Businesses or government agencies, And then surprise, surprise, these end users are like, I didn't ask for that, and that's not really what I want. So my approach has been to develop partnerships. So I've done this by, formally, this is like formal collaborative agreements. And the reason that I've done that is over the years, I've worked out that by doing this kind of formal, it's like a collaborative, a legal, it's an agreement. Money doesn't have to change hands, but it really kind of helps lock in what exactly we will do together, me and my external partner, what the timelines are, what the responsibilities are, and it generates buy-in from them and ownership of the project from them. This is not just a bit of work that I'm going to be doing that they may dip in and out of. It's about, no, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this properly. For example, the IUCN, we developed a collaborative partnership. We had phone calls for about 18 months every week, almost every week. And we just they bought into it, which was vital for me to actually be able to finish and, do that project in a collaborative way. Mastering the social dynamics of knowledge exchange and achieving research impact is critical. This is another word cloud, love word cloud. This is from Research Councils UK about, different pathways to impact. As you can see, engagement, networking, workshop, public, consultation, is any of this included in conventional scientific training? No, well, certainly wasn't when I did my undergrad. So you need, if you're going to do this type of work, you need to have a passion to want to do these things. This is definitely not for everyone. This is, there are scientists that can just stay in their ivory tower and in a university and do pure research, and that is fine. I think that's really important to emphasize. This is not for everyone. So you really need to want to do this. You need to be passionate about, tackling and doing these things. Other kind of social dynamics that I think are really important, the first one is communication, obviously, to be able to talk to outside people, to develop these collaborations. One thing I found particularly useful, as I said, this is only 3 years ago I started working with businesses. Active listening was really, really important to me. So I would, go and speak to businesses and say, what challenges are you facing around biodiversity? And they would mention, externalities, impacts, dependencies, risk matrices, like just all these kind of terms. I was like, oh, okay, write these down quickly. And then I had to learn what all these things meant, what they meant to businesses. And I then was able to use those terms to communicate back my science to them. And they're like, oh yes, that's exactly what we need. Because it's in our language. I'm like, oh, good, I used it right then. Trust, as I said, in building networks, building trust is critical. If you're not trusted, you're out. As simple as that. One important thing I think is also to recognise power dynamics between you and the people that you work with in the outside world, but also the power dynamics. Where are they placed within an organisation? I learned this a little bit late on, thanks to some research that one of our audience members is doing, Gary, who's looking down at the moment, but helped me kind of realise. Gary came and did some interviews with some of my collaborators to understand how they, have been learning and what they've benefited from this knowledge exchange partnerships. Power, it became quite apparent that, the power dynamics for some individuals within their organisations, they kind of had their hands tied in terms of how far they could take the work. And I didn't necessarily recognise that to start with. So that was really illuminating for me to understand that. And then it made a lot of sense, as to which collaborations went where when understanding those power dynamics. And then the second last is all about institutional support. This is something that I've written about in 2 papers with Christopher Tanovich and Bonnie Keeler and colleagues, lots of colleagues. To do this type of work, the foundation is I need to be supported by the university to do this. I need help to develop legal agreements, finance, admin. There's just all this stuff that, goes beyond what an individual postdoc may require. And it's really critical, I think. There's this expectation that, just go and start and you'll be fine. But for me to look professional to outside organisations, I need, professional, efficient support inside as well. And it's also about, if we all talk about research impact in the UK now, it's, this big thing, oh, we all need to achieve research impact. Well, if you want to, you need to invest in the people, invest in, career progression and training to be able to do this work. So I've had this wonderful opportunity for 3 years to do this with a NERC Knowledge Exchange Fellowship, but my fellowship ends after 3 years. What happens beyond? There seems to be kind of an investment at the moment from research councils into the early phases of achieving research impact, kind of short-term, either grants or fellowships that last for a couple of years, and then that's it. And then I was like, okay, well, how do I continue this on? There seems to be investment at the start of a pipeline, but there's a leaky pipeline. And a lot of people that do these knowledge exchange fellowships either go back to more pure research, they have to, play the papers game and everything else, or they leave. And finally, the last kind of tip about knowledge exchange is this is not a scientific process necessarily. So evaluating and learning as you go is really critical. And so this is a diagram that I showed you before, but you can, evaluate different stages of that knowledge exchange process and the influence that you have for your partners and the broader ecosystem of, practitioners that you're trying to help influence. It's really important to stop and reflect, to learn it as to what we can do better in the future and share that learning, publish it. There's this emerging kind of field of knowledge exchange and research impact practitioners that are starting to report this, to share our experience in the peer-reviewed literature. And so there you go. There's my 5 critical factors: networks, collaborative partnerships, social dynamics, institutional support, and evaluation. And so on that, I just would like to thank all the wonderful partners that I have formed partnerships with over the last 3 years. They're all there, they all know who they are, they're all awesome, and I've really, really enjoyed working with them. And of course, thank you to these scientists that I've worked with at ICCS, Damon Nagullen, Joe Bull, Will, Mike, Sam, who they're kind of, as you can see, I've been talking a lot about all the stuff I've been doing outside. I've also been trying to maintain being a scientist as well. So collaborating with these guys has really helped be able to do that. And of course, some awesome knowledge exchange fellows, Molly and Jen, and also some people that I found further afield in the Oxford network. Alice Purkis, who works in humanities, who's got a partnership with the National Trust. Murray Gardner, who helps develop industry partnerships with MPLS. And Gary, who's doing his PhD, actually understanding the process of knowledge exchange and the benefits that can generate both within a university and outside. So thank you to everyone, and thank you all for listening. Sorry.